pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Steve Dickerson. So some of you may know I'm the holder of the Frederick R. Dickerson Chair Professorship in Transportation. Well, that is thanks to Steve Dickerson, who endowed this professorship in his father's name. So thank you very much, Steve, for that. Much appreciated. But Steve Dickerson, he was actually a professor here in the School of Mechanical Engineering for many years, about 30 years, from 1965 to 1996. And so he's no stranger to Georgia Tech, and he's continued to be very actively associated with Georgia Tech, with engineering faculty, and he has a passion for transportation. In my just 1 year of interacting with him, I've been struck by his passion for transportation and how he feels all of us at Georgia Tech can be the leaders in solving the transportation challenges and problems we have, of course, in Atlanta and beyond. So I've been quite awestruck by your spirit of entrepreneurship. He's been quite the entrepreneur, spearheading several startups, the most recent being a transportation-oriented startup called RideCell LLC. I think we'll hear more about that today. And another one called Software, with Ware spelled as W-E-A-R. So he's kind of had his his technology entrepreneurship in several different domains. So I will let Steve talk about some of his ideas. He's always full of ideas, and perhaps challenge us to think about creative solutions. So Steve,
Thank you. I just got out of a board meeting for software automation. In fact, I had to leave early for this presentation. And software is aimed at automating garment sewing in an economical way so that we could bring the industry back to the United States. You probably realize about 95 to 97% of all garments are made offshore. That business was lost beginning in about 1960 on through the turn of the century to foreign production. Now, it does turn out that Ram's professorship was founded by another company I started by giving Tech the stock. That's really what I did, some stock. And that company happened to be in the machine vision business. Okay, and that's when I started also. And all of these things are based on the idea that there are ideas. And generally speaking, it's good to get a patent if that idea is novel. Okay, so in every case, there is a fundamental patent. Now today, we want to talk about urban transportation. And it really only has one component technologically that's tremendously important, and that is the standard smartphone. Okay? So I'm going to talk about applying the standard smartphone. Now I've got the darn camera on. I wish that wasn't the case, but nonetheless, I don't know that I can even turn it off. I've got to decline this phone call. Okay. Why can't I turn it off? I'm going to give it to somebody else. Is anybody familiar with an iPhone? You familiar?
yeah.
Okay, well, anybody familiar, turn off the camera if you would. But nonetheless, somehow it got started. And what we're talking about is, again, using the advanced cellular communications to improve urban transportation. And I quoted down here Mark Zuckerberg, just by accident here, that the biggest risk in our society almost is not taking risk. And the world is changed by doing things that might fail. And I'm used to that. I have had one failure to speak of that hasn't worked out well so far. But the other 4 or 5 companies I've started still do reasonably well. Okay? Now, let's see if I can go page down here. Now, again, all I'm showing here is that this technology of the cell phone, okay, is ubiquitous now. Everybody's got one. How many of you do not have a smartphone? Come on, no one? Everyone has a smartphone. There we are. So my statement that 90% is a reasonable statement of car drivers have a smartphone. Okay? And now, it turns out that in this illumination here, this illustration, I'm not only talking about ordinary GPS-inclusive smartphones, but I'm talking about the automobile itself. And this is an add-on that you can get from a company called Verizon Vehicle, which makes an older car smart. So you've got the ability to get dynamic directions with audio, you've got the ability to track the vehicle, etc. Okay? And that Verizon Vehicle happens to be an Atlanta-based company. Okay? And I've got one of those in one of my cars because that's an old car. It's a 2000 car, and it doesn't have the features that we're talking about. Okay? 2010. I shouldn't say 2000. Okay. Now, the people, the company that made it obvious that there was a tremendous potential for cell phones interacting with urban transportation was Uber. Right? We all know who Uber is. How many of you have taken a ride on Uber? Now look at that. Almost a majority have used Uber. And all Uber is, it turns out, is the use of the cell phone to do what I'm proposing here. That is to arrange a trip, make it convenient to start the trip, make it very convenient to get billed for the trip. Right? And that's all there is to it, in a sense. Now Georgia, I mean, we don't need the details, but Uber is now, and I put this in yesterday or the day before, is now approaching $70 billion in value. Okay? And there's been a lot of stuff about Uber. The front page of the Bloomberg Business Week happened to have Uber on it at one point. Georgia legalized, in many ways, Uber on May of 2015 in the state of Georgia. So some of the conflict went away. Now, it turns out, and this is typical of my problem, I invented Uber and related concepts in the year 2000. Notice the date up there. And once that got published by Georgia Tech in a publication that went out to the alumni mostly, you're faced with the issue of applying for a patent, because if you don't do it, you lose it, right? So this article described how you would use a cell phone, a smartphone, and you notice that the picture over here shows some things that are pretty antiquated. Well, why? Because the darn thing was published in the year 2000. And so if I were to read it, sort of a little section here, advances in communications, primarily wireless computing, have made it feasible to make massive substitutions of information technology for hardware such as roads, cars, rails, and energy, such as gasoline. Okay, now it does turn out, I'm going to go down here to the next slide. I think, let's see, page down. Page down is over here. There's the patent. Now, it was actually issued in February 2004. And it takes that long, right? It takes 3 or 4 years. 4 years is a typical number to get a patent issued when you apply for it. And this patent is for exactly what we're talking about, communications and computing-based urban transit. Okay? And if you read it, it's very, very straightforward. The communications and computing-based urban transportation system based on digital cellular communications, GPS locating, and digital computers to provide real-time command and control of passengers and vehicles with the objective of minimizing the social cost of trips in the urban environment. Now, right now, the biggest social cost probably is you're very often waiting in line because it's too much congestion, but there are other social costs. And the next page is sort of a part of the patent. It's a direct copy from the patent, okay? And it shows that you've got three parts of the system. You've got the people themselves, that's you and me, and people who drive for Uber. Let's call that part of the people. Then you've got a central assigning system, which, by the way, ends up at the bottom with billing and payment, right? You want to do all of these things without taking your billfold out. And then there's the vehicles. Now the vehicles, it can be mass transit, can be cars, buses, vans, etc., right? So you're trying to tie all these things together in a way that makes it very efficient to take a trip. Efficiency including lack of congestion, if you can get away with it. Okay? Now, I think this is going to take us a very short time to do the seminar, and then we can open it up for questions and answers. I'm talking now about a comprehensive urban transportation app. When I say comprehensive, that means it includes all the features that are listed below, and probably others that I haven't anticipated, right? So one of the features is that everybody is a subscriber. Why? Because it's very convenient to know the kind of origins, the specifics of your origins and destinations that are likely to be involved in a trip. So clearly home is one of them. Employment is one of them. Places that you go shop might be one of them. So those are locations, right? And then it's nice to know things like you sort of work 8 to 5, and that, by the way, the system can learn that, can't it? So that when you pull out the phone and run the app, it has largely anticipated what you're going to be asking for. And of course, one of the things that's part of your subscription is, are you willing to drive your own car as part of the trip and be assigned passengers? That's part of the overall subscription. And it will turn out that, I've probably got them later on here. I've got it down here. Let me go through it. All payments are made automatically. That, by the way, is a feature of the patent. We couldn't have gotten the patent without that feature. You can't say dynamic carpooling as a patentable item, right? It already was. Even in 2000, it was common. I did one for Georgia DOT probably in the 70s, okay? Where people could sign up and they could be assigned a carpool. But of course, it wasn't very dynamic. You got assigned and that was it, because you didn't have this to allow you to change it very, very easily. The third item here is dynamic ride sharing, Uber-like. And that can include dynamic buses, vans, and cars. And I'm going to talk about RideCell eventually. They already do some of this, okay? RideCell has the Georgia Tech license for this patent, which is owned by Georgia Tech, GTRC, okay? Now I put an asterisk there, and the asterisk on those means that in those areas, one can have incentives for people who ride share. Somehow get out of their single passenger car. You want to give them an incentive. So in the dynamic ride sharing, if you had 2 or 3 or 4 people, all of a sudden you might actually be being paid to do it, to drive it, from the government. Does anyone have any idea how much the subsidy is on MARTA?
65%.
How much?
65%.
That's a good answer. 65% of the cost of making a trip on MARTA is public expenditure. Now why? Why? Because if we can divert people from the highway, there is a social benefit. I keep calling it social benefit, but it's a benefit to the people. And you can subsidize it on that basis. Okay? Urban transit trips. What you'd like to do is walk up to the MARTA station and maybe not even take your phone out of your pocket. It lets you in and you get charged for the trip. Now in the short run, you probably have to take the phone out of your pocket and hold it up to a reader, okay? But instead of you having to have a MARTA pass, you're going to try to just use the cell phone to charge you for the trip. That's the thought process there. Dynamic parking. Now that one's got an asterisk to it also. And Georgia Tech does this, by the way. You can get a reduced parking charge at Georgia Tech, and I doubt if any of you use it, by telling the parking office that 3 of us are applying for the parking permit, and we're going to ride share. You can get that. So you can make parking an incentive to share a vehicle. And you can go directly to a spot. By the way, it's possible, of course, with this, to know where you parked. And all of a sudden, you don't have to have a reserved spot in the sense of a pass on your car. You could just go, and those reserved spots, those high occupancy spots, could be shared very easily. Now the other one here I think is very interesting, hot lane control. We have in Atlanta only one hot lane, I think, HOT, high occupancy total lane. And that's on 85, right? But all it takes to implement a hot lane is marking the lane, which might now be HOV, it might be something else that you mark. And if everybody who uses it has to have a smartphone or the moral equivalent of it, then you can bill them automatically and you can check to see if only authorized users are using it. Now the checking, by the way, is a law enforcement issue, and it probably has to be based on looking at license plates, which are done now. All the license plates can be read now. Okay? Where did I get to? Car rental, of course. Bike rental. All of those things could be handled by the system. Okay? And one of the things that's likely to happen, particularly at car rent, we're coming to the point where a reasonable fraction of all cars by urban trip makers, and particularly you kind of people who are young. What do we call the young people today? There's a word for it.
Young people?
Young people, there's a fancier term.
Millennials.
Huh?
Millennials.
What?
Millennials.
Millennials, that's right. More and more millennials, by the way, I couldn't think of the word. More and more millennials will end up sort of leasing a car or depending totally on car rentals. And by the way, RideCell has raised a considerable amount of money in California from a company, we happen to be a manufacturer of automobiles, that wants to be sure they're prepared to essentially sell cars into this shared car system. So you can envision, you bring your car to Georgia Tech, it's parked in a place that's known. If you allow it, a group of subscribers, which you have to sort of allow too, will be able to take that car and make a trip during the day. then when you get home, that car could be available to other people, usually that live near you. Now, in many cases, that's not a group of homes, but it's an apartment or townhouses or something like that. So you want that car rental and bike rental to be part of the overall system, and people can make arrangements for a rental, okay? But they can get some of their cost of their car paid back through the rental. And that'll become very popular, I almost guarantee it. That will become popular.
Don't you envision that that's the only mode of transportation when we have driverless vehicles? That
Well,
they would just be
driverless is not
driving-
in here yet. You're right. You're right. I've got a slide, which I'm not going to show, that shows advanced technology. But since you've asked the question, we may show it. We're 10 years away, sort of, from popular driverless vehicles. And that supports, of course, shared car, doesn't it? Very much. And it supports automatic guidance of the vehicle even if you've got 3 or 4 people in it. Sort of. In fact, already that's pretty well supported. I mean, I expect most of you use Waze or MapQuest or Google to get around Atlanta, right? So that's a feature of eventually of automated cars, as well as very low accident rates with automated cars. We will cut, I'm glad you brought up the question, but we'll cut the fatality rate in half with automated cars. And then greater safety features. You do want, on MARTA, and people bring up this issue, I'm afraid to ride with somebody else. Well, if your application effectively knows who you're riding with and where you are, you can pull out the phone, and maybe you're still running it, the app, and say, emergency, and everything is taken care of for you. You've done a 911 call, automatically, right? Now, I probably haven't got a complete list there, but that's the kind of things we're talking about.